2 summers ago, I attended SUSI, the Southeast Unitarian Universalist Summer Institute, on the beautiful campus of Western Carolina University, nestled in the Appalachian Mountains near Asheville. For 1 week in July, nearly 1,000 Unitarian Universalists occupy and make use of nearly every campus facility, including dorms and classrooms, auditoriums, the field house, and not least the dining hall 3 times a day. This is where most of the Unitarian Universalists who attend SUSI interface with the employees on the campus. Well, the summer that I was there, because of the scheduling that SUSI leaders created, every mealtime, the dining hall was inundated with several hundred people at one time, which caused big headaches for not only the people being served, but for the servers. I witnessed a lot of frustration and some rude behavior from my fellow UUs toward campus employees who appeared to be doing the best that they could. In addition, the campus prohibition against smoking and alcohol consumption was openly ignored by some participants. And even though the SUSI mission is to provide a one-week experience evoking the best within us in concert with Unitarian Universalist principles, the SUSI mission, we weren't living out our principles very well, nor were we being very polite guests. And yes, even though we paid to be there, we were guests still. This concept came home to roost when the Western Carolina University administration told SUSI organizers a year later that we weren't welcome back. SUSI leaders scrambled to make amends, and we were given one more chance last summer to prove we were capable of being amenable guests. Now, I was still on the SUSI minister chat during this announcement and kerfuffle when one minister lamenting about the situation chimed in with this comment. They said, we come in and just take over a place, bending it to our own will and need without consideration for the values and cultures of the institution or the people from whom we receive hospitality. They went on to say, not only is this a consumerist model of behavior, but it's also colonizing behavior. Considering what I had witnessed while at SUSI, this minister's comment suddenly made concrete for me the idea of colonization. With the assumption of privilege and being on the right side of things, we keep repeating the come in and take over and bend everything to our will behavior of our colonizing forebears. We need a different way of being in the world. And with intention, we can change our default mode. Last year, SUSI attendees did just that. Director Amy Carroll Webb states on the SUSI website that, quote, the Western Carolina University Conference team has renewed our contract for 2023, saying, you did well at shifting your culture and it was noticed. Now, I don't know if my story helps you make sense of what we as Unitarian Universalists have been grappling with in recent decades And that is an unflinching acknowledgement that our religion was founded by colonists who displaced First Peoples in the land that would become New England. While today we seek justice, equity, and compassion in our human relations, that's part of our 7 principles, we are heir to the doctrine of discovery and the implication that 15th century Christian Europeans were entitled by papal decree to take whatever they pleased from non-Christians everywhere, anywhere and everywhere. Unitarians have roots that connect with the first wave of pilgrim emigres of the 1620s to Plymouth, who supposedly shared the first Thanksgiving meal with the Wampanoag. Those were the first people, the Wampanoag were the first peoples of Massachusetts and part of Rhode Island. Now, we need to be careful about applying our present-day values to those of the past. But at the same time, we need to be aware of how we tend to propagate that without consciousness. Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz is the author of An Indigenous People's History of the United States, and she tells us that in her research of historical documents of the time, that any meals shared between colonists and the Wampanoag was nothing like that depicted in our Thanksgiving myth. And this is something that is perpetuated in a famous painting by J.L.M. Ferris. And I don't know if you can picture this in your mind, but it shows a white woman offering a platter of food to Native American men while her buckle-hatted husband looks on. Numerous other colonists are standing around a table placed outdoors, and this included a child and what looked like a hunting dog. Today, this looks downright smarmy to me, and in fact, Ortiz likens the painting to fake news of the time. A kind of a definite slant in reporting, right? To even name the painting, the first Thanksgiving, is inaccurate, as no historical document from that era ever mentions that word or phrase. And the meal would have been known to the colonists as a harvest celebration or feast or festival. And it would have been the same among the Wampanoag because they were indigenous peoples and they would have celebrated the bounty of the harvest in the earth. The truth, according to Ortiz, is this: the colonists and the Wampanoag had an uneasy political alliance, a tenuous relationship formed by treaty, which served the survival of each party. In terms of sharing a meal, it's more likely, Ortiz says, that there was no intention on the part of the colonists to break bread with the Wampanoag. However, an account of related events describes the colonists' festivities. They had a good harvest because the indigenous people showed them how to plant, right? They had a good harvest. They were celebrating, and in that celebration, some of the men exuberantly discharged their firearms. Well, hearing the shots from afar, about 90 Wampanoag men arrived at the colonial settlement to find out what was happening. Remember, they had an alliance. So not invited per se, these men, these Wampanoag, were nonetheless invited to eat with the colonists. The Wampanoag, immediately seeing that there was not enough food for the 90 men that they brought with them, sent a contingent of Wampanoag out on a hunting foray, and they came back with 5 deer and offered them up to the colonists. That was more likely the so-called first Thanksgiving. Now, what is the harm of a romanticized version of a meal shared between colonists and native peoples? So what? It didn't really happen that way, right? Well, wrong, because the answer involves the danger of a single story. For 400 years, our country has been in receipt of a narrative controlled by the colonists, the story of a people favored by God who came upon a new Zion in the wilderness, these being the pilgrims. They were welcomed, the story goes, by the native people who showed them how to hunt and plant bountiful crops. And in return, when the harvest came in the next fall, the colonists shared a great feast with the native people in thanksgiving for their help. The single story, the myth of the first Thanksgiving, obscures the truth that the Wampanoag and the colonists were as reliant upon one another as they were at odds with one another. The single story obscures the fact that the colonists were invaders of a land already occupied by a people who had no concept of land ownership. The single story omits the fact that Europeans, especially the Spanish, had been coming to the shores of North America for nearly a century, and in the decades preceding the English colonial settlements, these Europeans had enslaved indigenous peoples and spread disease along the eastern seaboard from Florida to Maine, decimating entire tribes. The single story omits what came after the so-called first Thanksgiving, which was further displacement and destruction of indigenous peoples by the continuing migrations from Great Britain and the expansion of the English colonialism. Now, by ignoring the truth of harm and injustice wrought by the founders of our country, without acknowledging the sins of our forebears, and offering condolence to those whose ancestors lived a very different story from those of our forebears, we today live with unhealed wounds because we don't acknowledge the wrongdoing. We live with unhealed wounds that I think undermine a healthy social structure. By ignoring the fact that most of us live and have our being on stolen land, there exists a brokenness, a permanent tear in the fabric of our society, a crack in the foundation of our most cherished institution, democracy. Democracy for whom? For who? So in living our single story, we can't help but continue to marginalize those that are not included in our story. And as Unitarian Universalists who affirm and promote the dignity of every person and strive for justice, equity, and compassion in our human relations, we are called to seek a different story. Our 7 principles call us to seek a different story, to dispense with the single story. In this way, we can begin to integrate a different story into our consciousness, bringing ourselves back to wholeness and integrity and healing. We can offer condolences to those who have reason to mourn Columbus Day and Thanksgiving, and in freeing ourselves from the denial and fragility that keeps us separated from First Peoples, and in fact disconnected from the land, from the land on which we live and have our being, we might see our way to a higher consciousness, honoring right relationship with all peoples, and embracing more fully our seventh principle, which is affirming and promoting the interdependency of all life on this planet, of which we are a part. We're not at the top of the chain, we're a part of it. I've often wondered if I were put on trial for living out the seventh principle, could I be convicted? Probably not enough evidence. This Thanksgiving, I invite us to embrace a different story. Instead of telling your children, your grandchildren, or your great-grandchildren the tired old first Thanksgiving myth, tell them about the three sisters, the staple of Native American agriculture, which are corn, beans, and squash. Planted in rows in that order, these crops grow together and benefit each other in nutrients and provide a well-rounded food staple for people. Carbohydrates, protein, and other beneficial nutrients. The tradition of calling these crops the Three Sisters originated with the Haudenosaunee, better known as the Iroquois, but please don't call them the Iroquois. They occupy regions around the Great Lakes in northeastern United States and Canada. But Iroquois is a name given to the Haudenosaunee, and it translates roughly into clown face. So, Haudenosaunee, a little more challenging, but much more accurate. Anyway, tell the story of the First Peoples' gift of the Three Sisters to all of us, to all the peoples of America, yesterday and today, because without that, we would be looking at an entirely different, we would be in an entirely different way, if at all, here. Now, if you have listened carefully to our worship leader's call to begin the service, as of late, you'll know that we've begun to acknowledge that we occupy the land of the First Peoples, the Yagas and the Yagas and the Seminoles. A proper and formal land acknowledgement requires a more involved process in which we of the fellowship have not engaged. Thankfully, Alison Rognas, astute and caring member of this fellowship, pointed that out to me. So I'm going to now ask her to come up and tell you a little bit about land acknowledgements. Alison?
Hi. This introduction to land acknowledgement comes from Why Land Acknowledgements Are Important by Dr. Vivian Timmons, the President and Vice Chancellor of Memorial University of Newfoundland in Canada. It is an Indigenous practice to acknowledge the land and territory that you are on. When Indigenous peoples visited other Indigenous peoples, they acknowledged their territories. Land is sacred to Indigenous peoples, and ways of being and knowing come from the land. Land acknowledgements recognize the unique and enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous peoples and their traditional territories. They are a way to recognize and respect the original peoples of the territory upon which the university is situated. Land acknowledgements are a way to share space with Indigenous peoples through the weaving of Indigenous protocols into university procedures. Land acknowledgements prompt us to think about relationships between Indigenous peoples and institutions. They are a means of creating awareness of Indigenous presence and land rights in everyday life. According to many Indigenous scholars, including Mi'kmaq Professor Benita Lawrence, decolonization begins with the acknowledgement that there is land theft and dispossession. Land acknowledgements are a way to recognize history of colonialism and to remind us of the many involuntary sacrifices of Indigenous peoples in the creation and maintenance of settler spaces. Land acknowledgements disrupt settler colonialism and challenge the myth that the land was empty when the settlers arrived. They are a reminder of the generosity of Indigenous peoples for sharing the land with visitors. Land acknowledgements must be accompanied by a commitment to real change. Land acknowledgements are not a box to check, although they can easily become a token gesture rather than a meaningful practice. They become meaningful if we are willing to learn and exercise accountability and respect. This next land acknowledgement comes from our nearby College of Nursing at FAU. We share a lot of space that they share, so we're on a lot of very nearly the same land. Florida Atlantic University, Christine Elin College of Nursing recognizes that we are on taken land and acknowledges the Indigenous people currently living on the lands, their ancestors, future generations, culture, harvest, language, poetry, and living songs. The purpose of this land acknowledgement is to honor the Indigenous history and to state our commitment to protect these places and people. FAU consists of campuses in Harbor Branch, Jupiter, Boca Raton, Fort Lauderdale, Davie, and Dania Beach, residing on Yega, Ace, Tequesta, Taino, and Seminole lands. Generations of Indigenous peoples and tribes have resided on these lands and nearby sacred sites for over 10,000 years. The land and waterways continue to carry their stories, including those for survival and identity. We acknowledge these tribes' rich history and our country's role in their removal from this land. The FAU College of Nursing believes that a caring environment is one in which all aspects of the person are respected, nurtured, and celebrated. We are committed to uplifting the voices of Indigenous people and learning from their philosophies, promoting harmony, unity, and healing. UUFBR have not ourselves written a land acknowledgement, so I am grateful to have these words to learn from and to consider.
Thank you, Alison. We will try to put those documents on the website, and I invite us to, at a minimum, change the first Thanksgiving stories that we tell, if you do tell them, and also to resist them in our institutions like our schools. But I also invite UUFBR, you, the congregation, perhaps spearheaded by Healing Justice, or it could be a separate project on its own, to enter the process of a land acknowledgement with the Seminoles and Tequesta and other existing tribes of local lands. The Yaga no longer exist. And it's the same for the Timucuan Indians up in Volusia County. They died out in the 17th century. By undertaking a land acknowledgement, we begin to live more wholly. That's WHOLLY. You could take it as HOLY too. We begin to live more wholly, more authentically, more justly, and more compassionately. By taking up this process of land acknowledgement, we reject the single story and become exemplars for a more fair and just society. Let justice begin with us in our house of liberal religion here in Boca Raton. May it be so.